recording and let people in. Sorry, I had to.
No, it's quite all right.
It's exciting, Jeff.
But Emerson, I think, is her choice. We're waiting on BU. We haven't heard from BU yet.
Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. I'm just gonna give it a couple more seconds, see if anyone else pops on before we begin. Welcome, welcome. Hope everyone has a nice cold beer in hand. All right. Welcome to Malt Handling, the 8th day of the New York State Craft Brewers Conference presented by DWS. My name is Jen Myers. I'll be the moderator for this session, and presenting today will be Jeff Hughes from Country Malt. Hey Jeff, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Jen?
I'm good, thank you.
Welcome, everybody.
Just a couple things before we begin. If you wouldn't mind, please keep yourselves on mute. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in chat or use the hand emoji and we'll call on you when it's appropriate. Also, if you wouldn't mind signing the conference attendee sheet, I'll post the link here shortly in chat. And then just a very important and thank you to our sponsors for this conference. Our Wednesday presenting sponsors are TLF Graphics, and our Wednesday session sponsors are Breeze Malt Ingredients, Link 2 Hospitality Solutions, and Ultimate Brew Service. Thank you so much to our allied members for making this possible. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Hughes. Jeff, go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen. So I'm going to do a little thing on some malt handling in the brewery. And as Jen mentioned, I'm with the Country Malt Group. I did want to real quickly just kind of go over this with our company because this happened right after the pandemic happened. We demerged from Country Malt, along with these other companies, demerged from Graincore, which is our Australia parent company. And we formed a separate company called United Malt. And United Malt consists of some malting companies as well as some distribution companies. The malting companies are, most of you are familiar with Canada Malting, obviously, Great Western, Baird's Malt out of the UK, and Barrett Burston out of Australia, which we don't carry any Barrett Burston here in North America, but it is one of our companies. And then for the distribution arms, you all familiar with the Country Malt Group. We distribute obviously in North America and actually now in Asia and Mexico and the Caribbean, South America as well. But Brewer Select is the UK and Cryer Malt is New Zealand, Australia. So just a kind of an interesting change that we've gone through, and now we are known as United Malt. So so overview of topics, silo, referring to silo malts or silos exclusively. I know you can think of bulk as totes or super sacks, and we'll touch on those as well. Key parameters, helpful additions, and like I just mentioned, we'll talk about tote alternatives or super sacks. Grain handling, we'll talk about conveyance types, truck to silo, transfer, silo to mill, weighing and milling, and mill to grist case. And then some other considerations like maintenance. You know, if you're doing these expansions, you need to consider regulatory bodies and safety. And a big thing, especially up here for us in New York in the summer is, well, year round, but more so in the summer, is pest control. So silo design and location. So we have kind of a comparison chart here of bagged malt versus bulk malt. You know, malt damage or pre-milling malt is very low with bagged malt. With bulk malt, it can be low or can be high because of how bulk malt can be low to moderate, again, with how it's transferred. Milling quality, bagged malt is typically high. Reason being is that your suppliers typically have pretty high quality mills. I know in the warehouses we mill in, we have very expensive 4-roller mills. We typically are pretty consistent with our crush, and I think we do a pretty good job, as I would imagine most do. And obviously milling quality in the brewery can be low to high depending on the quality mill, the same settings. Obviously, it's moderate and easy with bulk malt. Moderate and high can be complex with bulk malt. Dust and housekeeping is an issue, especially with bulk malt, not so much with bag malt. Equipment maintenance, there really isn't any with bag malt, obviously, but lots of equipment to keep an eye on and maintain when you're talking about delivery systems from a silo, hoppers and mills, et cetera. And labor, obviously physical labor with bag malt is high. With bulk malt, it's low. It's automated conveyance, et cetera. So as mentioned before, OSHA involvement with bag malt is really not much of an issue. It's low with bulk malt, but we're seeing more and more intervention, at least before the pandemic. We were seeing them kind of sticking their nose out and making sure things were spec there. Ease of delivery. Obviously with bag malt, typically it's easy. You get your pallet, you put it away. Bulk malt can be very easy, but it also can be very complex depending on location of your silo and the type of conveyance needed, et cetera. Pricing, obviously with bag malt, it's moderate to high. I mean, it's the entry level way to get malt, obviously, so it's the highest price. And with bulk malt, it's obviously much lower to moderate, but it's also less stable because there's a little bit less of a margin to the companies. So we have to build in market values when it comes to trucking. That does fluctuate quite a bit and is a little less stable. So silo design and location, a lot of this makes it's really common sense, but you really want that silo as close to everything as possible, as close to as reasonably possible to the brew house and the mill. Ideally less than 50 feet away from the mill. You can go further. It's more expensive when you're talking about longer distance, not just because of the amount of material, but also the type of conveyance you need with longer runs is more expensive. Ground level is typically best for a silo. Additional conveyance or damage in the case of pneumatic transfer. Typically I'd say 90 to 95% of the bulk malt customers I have, they fill their silos pneumatically from a truck. So by pushing it with air, if the silo is up on the roof, obviously it needs to be pressurized a little more to get the malt up, which causes a little bit of more damage to that. On the roof line, I see this all the time. I have customers down in Long Island and near the city, especially that want silos, but cannot for this reason. That's maybe all concerns for neighbors. It typically takes a couple hours to unload a bulk load. So, if your tractor trailer is pulling up to unload and you're blocking off your neighbors, obviously you got to take that in consideration. Silo capacity. It's a common mistake that don't have experience, big their loads will be. Typically, our loads are between 21 and 23 metric tons, but we really recommend capacity to be 15 to 20%. There's a couple reasons. One, when you pneumatically blow malt into a silo, you have a 30-degree inverse cone that forms. So it's not flat, obviously. If you picture it blowing in, it's going to form an inverse cone. And so you need space for that to accommodate that as the silo gets close to full. Secondly, if your silo is not completely empty, obviously left for the last load, which is not ideal. We like to see silos emptied every time if possible, but we understand that's not really possible all the time. So they say about 60,000 pounds minimum, or a capacity of 1,700 cubic feet. You want to size the silo based on bulk malt density, which is approximately 34 pounds per cubic foot. So if you do the math, you can kind of figure that out. We recommend a 45-degree cone not a 60-degree cone on the with a smaller sidewall and a smaller diameter, obviously. Always recommend a top manway for maintenance and inspection. You want to be able to look in there. You want to possibly be able to clean it. And a ladder and cage obviously would be required to get up to the top of the manway. The height of your silo must match the planned unload to conveyance. You got to plan the conveyance and silo dimensions at the same time. You need to really figure everything out to make sure it is what is going to work. For pneumatic unloads, you do need a vent tube, a 5-inch diameter vent tube, or 5 inches, but 5 feet off the ground. There you would actually add a dust sock to that. That is what collects and stops the dust from going everywhere when you fill the silo. That's typically a requirement for us. Sometimes our truck drivers won't unload if it's not properly vented. Obviously, that can be a hazard, but also with a dust sock, you want to be able to contain and eliminate the dust from going all over. There's all sorts of, just a big mess, but also there's explosion hazards as well with the dust. You want to be sure to ask about seismic. This varies for region to region, but seismic, snow load, wind, other environmental concerns that would affect the silo. So you want to make sure the manufacturer is clear on your area and what those requirements are. And engineering your cement pad is required. You need to understand the total weight of the silo filled. You need to consider for frost heave, especially up here, and the plans must meet all local laws and regulations. So designing location, again, straight walled silos are better than bolt together corrugated silos, but they are more costly. But the straight steel side, low maintenance, much longer lasting. Especially considering in a maritime environment where it's very humid. The straight walled silos are completely contained and sealed, whereas corrugated bins are, again, bolted together. There's gaskets involved. The gaskets can fail over time, need to be replaced. So moisture can get into the silo. Bugs can get into the silo. All these things cause huge issues, obviously. And also, the corrugated bins are not straight. So there's the dust can build up in those ridges and cause problems down the line as well. But again, corrugated silos are much more affordable. Brewery logo is cool. A lot of people love adding a logo to their silo. It's like a big sign to their brewery. But again, it's really difficult to do that. Not impossible, but difficult with corrugated bins. With the straight walled steel bins, it is much easier. We don't recommend load cells on a silo. It's very expensive, and we'll get into that a little more later as far as accuracy as well. I always recommend, and I very rarely see it, it is a way to be able to take a look at what's in your silo, and that's adding sight glasses. I've seen up to like 5 sight glasses from the top of the cone all the way to the top of the silo. And when the sight glasses are just a few inches from a pretty long distance away, you can actually see where the malt is in the silo. So just by a quick glance, a brewer can say, oh, my silo is like half full. And then you can get closer with a flashlight when it gets lower, and you can shine it in the sight glass and really see, how low in the cone the level of malt is, so you know when to do it by weight. They measure their brews batch to batch, and they subtract it from the overall delivery. But what they don't take in consideration is that typically brewery scales, as accurate as they may be, are typically still a margin of error of up to 2%. And if you're talking, up to 2% on a 48,000 pound load of barley, you're talking up to 1,000 pound margin of error there. So you may have to shut down and not see when your malt is actually going to run out if you don't have a secondary way or a better way to really take a look at what's left in your silo. So it's something to consider. I always recommend sight glasses. Two base malts, coming up with the expenditure of adding a silo. A second one's a little difficult. They are expensive. But if budget and space allow, it really makes sure brewery operate over to the other and keep operating, and then call for a refill on your other one. We usually we fill silos. You know, we ask for a week's notice, but we typically can do it in even a little bit less than that. Pay attention to the manufacturer design drawings. You want to note the locations of all the fittings. Level sensors, that's another option. You can actually put level sensors inside the silo. I prefer sight glasses because it's one less thing to break. Sight glasses typically aren't going to break. Obviously, you need a manway. You want to make sure the manway, the ladder, the art of the logo, all that stuff is in specs. So you want to double, triple check the plans and all that before the silo is manufactured and delivered. So totes, you know, with the cost and complexity of simplify their malt handling. I actually just wrote an article on this, which should be posted on the Country Malt website sometime soon. But I see a lot of times a brewery a small brewery that's had some success and they want to jump right up to a silo. And that could be possible for them, and they may be able to maintain the cash flow that it costs, or that it's required to $16,000 to $20,000 per load. So you need the cash flow to maintain that possibility. And totes are really a great stepping stone. Push a lot of these breweries to consider a tote station and totes. Tote stations consist of a frame that holds a 1 metric ton tote or super sack. You usually can add batch weighing capacity to that tote and conveyance to your mill. And it's a lot less expensive than a silo. I mean, you can actually get a real simple tote rack for a few $1,000. If you want to build a really nice system where you can convey your malt from the tote into your mill, etc. With Country Malt too, blend totes are also available. I'm sure the other suppliers do this as well, where we can basically put your recipe into a tote. So it's literally just dump your tote into your mash and brew your batch of beer for that particular recipe. Further simplifies brewing, obviously. So tote stations aren't a lost investment if you're going to eventually go to the silo either, because once you go to the silo, you still have your tote station, and then you can add, you know, one of your secondary malts that you use a lot of. You know, these days with New England, you know, your secondary malts, then you can start saving money on those instead of getting them in bags, and use the tote station in addition to the silo. So tote station is a great stepping stone if you're on your way to a silo down the line. So we're going to talk about conveyance. So, you know, all methods of conveyance damage malt to some degree. The key is really to find the balance of, you know, speed, moving the malt quickly in a manner that only results in minor damage. And obviously, like, we all need it to be as affordable as possible. So you have a number of points within the brewery where conveyance would be required. The truck to, you know, we send full rail cars to their silo directly. The silo to the mill, bag dump station to a mill to grist case to mash mixer, lauter ton to spent grain bins or silo as well. You know, each with benefits and challenges. We'll talk about them now. So pneumatic conveyance, as I mentioned before, is typically the way that we most often see trucks loading silos. So the grain is suspended and moved by a fast flowing stream of air within a metal tube. High damage due to high velocity, impact of grain with the walls of the tube, and especially the couplings and the fittings. I recommend that when you're designing your silo location, that a semi can pull up to the silo as close as possible. They typically carry 2 or 3 10-foot hoses Ideally, we only want to use one because the less couplings, the better. The more hoses, the more couplings, the more damage the malt endures because of blowing through the insides of the tubes at a high rate. Bends in the tubing work, but you want to keep them to a minimum. Obviously, the sharper the bends, lots of right angles. In some breweries have obviously like permanent pipes that go through a building into their silo, and there's lots of 45-degree angles, and those really damage the malt. Pipework's also is actually inexpensive, and having a pneumatic blower and pipework in the brewery is, I think I've only seen it once or twice. It's costly. There's a lot of maintenance with the blower. Not the ideal situation, but augers, obviously everybody's aware of. Augers are another option, and they're different kinds. We have a solid core auger with a solid axle in the middle and a solid housing. They're fast. They don't damage the malt a whole lot. The cons are you can't really bend them, so it has to be straight shots all the way. And changing in direction requires a transfer to another conveyor, but they are relatively inexpensive. So flex augers are a hollow core auger. It's basically a screw inside a PVC. Benefits are they're flexible, so you can bend them to go around curves. They are definitely notorious for high damage, especially when people put them at a high angle. I mean, typically you want to keep flex augers mostly horizontal. I mean, we recommend that you don't go over 20 degrees at any angle. What happens, being that the whole center of it is hollow, especially on a steep rise, the malt just keeps falling back down inside the tube and then gets chewed up by that screw auger, and you really can do a lot of damage to the malt, and can cause a lot of problems in the brew house. They are inexpensive. I do see them more often than anything else, and they are certainly acceptable for short and hopefully horizontal conveyance or just very short runs in general. Bucket elevators, very low damage. There's a little picture on the right of the slide of what a bucket elevator would look like. I've seen one brewery with these. They're very expensive, so there's a lot of maintenance involved, and it's vertical lift only, but the benefit is the lowest amount of damage. Cable disc, you have chain and disc, obviously, and cable disc. They're more or less the same thing, but and there may have been some improvements to these designs, but typically the chain and disc is looked at as a little more robust than the cable disc. Belts, smooth or cleated belts within an enclosure. These are what we use at all the malting plants. This is how we transfer raw barley and malts from vessel to vessel or building to building. You can't have, horizontal and limited elevation horizontal and vertical elevation is a little difficult with this type of conveyance, but it's certainly very gentle on the malt, and that's why we use them in all our malt houses. We want to incur the least amount of damage at the malt house before we send the malt to you as possible. And they can operate at very high speeds and move a lot of malt in a short period of time. Obviously, gravity is our friend. That can be one of the best ways to move malt. It's relatively free. They're inexpensive, and conveyance can be minimized or avoided if you can somehow build kind of a system that's layered top to bottom. It's very gentle, obviously, and malt houses are very, this is a common way malt houses operate, right? We have these big tall buildings at the malt house. The steep tanks are on the top, and then you go down to the germination beds and then down to the kilns, and it's all done by gravity. Again, conveyance types, a little more detail on the chain and disc. You have the hard plastic discs. They're joined by chain links within a hollow tube. Gentle handling. They can be relatively high speed. The diameters there can give you a general idea of how much malt you can move. With a 3-inch, it's 5 metric tons per hour. 4 is 10 metric tons per hour. 5-inch would be 15 metric tons per hour. It's kind of a ballpark approximation. Good for changes in plane. They can go vertical, horizontal, any angles. Long runs are possible. So if you can't get your silo near your brew house, and this is a common problem chain and disc is where you're going to want to be as far as transferring your malt in the malt house from the silo. You can have multiple inlets, so you can add your tote stations, add your bag dump stations, all that kind of stuff within the conveyance line, so that you can just kind of add your malt at any stage into the conveyance line to get to the mill. They can be run empty, obviously, but there is a loop system required. The chain has to go somewhere and it has to come back to where it started. So you have to take that in consideration. And the costs are definitely a little bit higher with these systems. So truck to silo. So as I already mentioned, pneumatic is the most common. But again, it does contribute to some damage. We want to limit that damage by keeping the transfers between 5 and 7 PSI. And all our truck drivers for our carriers are well aware of this. This is what these guys do. Bit of a higher importance is the length of time that transfer takes. Usually it's 70, 90 minutes. It can be up to 2 hours. Typically is the longest time for 20 metric tons. Like I mentioned, we are typically around 21 to 23 metric tons per load. A lot of people think we'll lower the pressure. I've actually had brewers tell the truck drivers to lower the pressure. Their intentions were good. They think it causes less damage, but actually too low of pressure causes more damage to the malt as well, because it bangs around even more inside the tubes. So you need to really kind of hit that sweet spot of 5 to 7 PSI. And there are exceptions to that. There are breweries that have incredibly long runs. And so we have to run it at 8, 9, 10 PSI in order to get it to work properly. But 5 to 7 with a low to moderate run is the general rule of thumb. Increased malt moisture, which may not be desirable for the brew house, but it may assist in controlling damage of the malt in a pneumatic delivery system. Not that you want to be adding moisture to your malt or anything like that. As mentioned before, conveyors actually and bucket elevators are the lowest damage, but they're high cost, they're bulky, not typically what you would want to use in a small to mid-size craft brewery. Bucket elevators are typically used in real large craft breweries or places like Anheuser-Busch, that type of thing. Solid core auger, as talked about before, with a swing out transfer auger is a low cost option, and chain and disc is also an option for truck to silo. So silo to mill, we talked about this already a little bit, but the hollow core flex augers are very common. It's what I see the most often when I'm traveling around visiting breweries. They function, but they can cause a significant amount of damage, as previously discussed. And so we don't recommend them, but obviously we understand costs are important, and they certainly can work if you take the cons in consideration and try to keep sharp angles to a minimum. Especially short runs, they're fine. You can use them for short runs for sure. Chain and disc is an excellent option. I really recommend chain and disc really for the reasons mentioned previously. It can be set up to use the same chain and disc loop for the conveyance to fill the silo as well. A combination of a belt conveyor and bucket elevator, again, is also very good, but very costly and bulky, as mentioned. For bag malt, you want a dump station somewhere within your system. You're going to want to be able to add your specialty malts. I mean, even big breweries are only adding, a bag or two of certain things at a time. Especially with your black malts, chocolate malts, and heavy crystal malts, things like that. So you can use a solid core auger or chain and disc or whatever you're using in the brewery for conveying specialty malt to the mill. And one thing I forgot to mention before that's not in this presentation that I run into a lot is when considering building a bulk malt system and grain delivery system, I think it's very important to make sure there's a way to get grain out of your silo that's not just going into the mash tun. I've seen so many systems, probably the majority of systems people build, there really isn't any way to get the grain out of the silo other than putting it directly into the mash tun. There's no way unless you disassemble the conveyance system. And in my opinion, it's super important for a few reasons. For one, what if your buddy down the street, your brewer buddy needs a tote of base malt? You can just fill a tote off your silo and help them out. What if you want to empty your silo, which is super important, empty your silo before your next delivery. You can keep a couple totes on hand, empty the remaining grain and possibly dust and chaff that you want to get rid of out of the bottom of the silo. We also had a customer somewhere in Virginia or somewhere in the mid-Atlantic that received a delivery from our competitor by accident. So a competitor sent a truckload of Munich malt to a customer's silo. And so nothing that was usable to them because they only use their silo for base malt. And they really didn't have an easy way to get it out. And so our competitor was stuck with having to vacuum out the silo at an immense cost. And so just another reason why it's great to be able to get malt out of your silo other than just in your enclosed brewing system. And one other thing to touch on with that is silo fills. It is ideal to empty your silo fully between fills. What happens is when you blow in your malt into the silo pneumatically, which is what is most common, a lot of dust and chaff is stirred up during the process, and that settles down after the fill is over. But you always end up with a few inches of dust and chaff on top of your grain bed. So when you go to empty your silo, that last brew could be a little rough because you could get a stuck mash, lower efficiencies because of that dust and chaff. But if you don't empty it out and you just keep filling it and leaving a little bit of that behind, that layer of dust and chaff builds up immensely over 4, 5, 6 loads. And I've had a couple customers that did not follow that advice, and their whole chain of disk systems were seized up by the dust and chaff. So again, another great practice is to try to empty it out as best you can every time. We recommend you don't go over 3 fills without emptying it completely. We do realize that's not always convenient or easy for the brewers to do, but definitely never go more than 3 fills without emptying the silo completely. Another reason to have a way to get malt out so you can kind of empty it as you're expecting another load. So at some point you have to weigh your malt, right? It's going into a recipe, you need a specific amount. Load cells in the silo have been used by folks in the past. We don't recommend that. They are super expensive because of the amount of weight they must be able to measure. And the margin of error is there that it's not going to be perfect. So because it's such a large amount of malt. So inline weighing prior to the mill or load cells on the grist case are both good options. There are flow scales people are using that actually use a programmable controller, and they measure the mass of the malt as it travels through the conveyance system. I think those are great. They are a little expensive. A dumping hopper setup above the scale is an inexpensive option. Obviously, there's a labor cost there. You kind of like weighing in chunks of the recipe at a time. A programmable controller tied into load cells on the grist case is really the best option. You just literally have a digital readout. You have load cells on there and measures out, as you're adding malt to the grist mill. Best way to go. When talking about totes, having load cells on your tote station will accomplish the same thing with your tote malt. So mill to grist case, again, hollow core flex augers are the most common. I just took a couple pictures off of Google here to kind of demonstrate what they look like on the inside. You can see it's hollow, but you can see if this is at an angle, obviously the grain keeps falling down the middle of this and gets chewed up continuously. So again, if you're not careful with the length of these runs, they're cheap. They have some flexibility, physical flexibility, but not ideal. A little better of an option for damage control of the malt is the solid core auger. If you can picture this working inside of a tube, it's gently transferring the malt as it's kind of acting like a screw, and is a little bit better option for less damage and relatively inexpensive. So mill to grist case. You obviously want to try to get all your grain milled in before you mash in. You know, mash times are generally pretty quick for good reason, especially with single temperature mashes, which I think are most common. Not a lot of step or decoction mashes going on out there. I mean, I'm sure people are using them still, but with how well malt is modified these days, it's typically not necessary. So you want to be able to make sure everything's milled and ready to go in a grist case before you actually start mashing in, if at all possible. Usual milling times are anywhere from a half hour to 60 minutes. Obviously, it's all depending on the size of the mill, size of the batch, pounds of malt you need to mill, etc. But yeah, milling directly into the mash mixer is not ideal because of the time and the temperature effect it will have. Taking longer time, the temperature of the malt may affect the temperature of your mash. Also, obviously, increases the brew day as well, which we're all trying to be more efficient. Four masher, grist hydrator are obviously great options as well, as the malt's coming from the grist case to the mash. So other considerations, you know, malt handling system at the brewery will require regular maintenance. There's a lot of machinery and moving parts, just like any piece of equipment. Flighting on augers can become sharp over time, which leads to more damage, you know, wear, possible breakdowns, etc. So regular housekeeping is important. Additional cleaning is required from time to time. You have definitely more of a dust buildup handling bulk malt like this. Dust explosions are a big concern. You need to make sure that you know, you're properly handling your malt in your malt room, as well as the conveyance systems and keeping the dust under control. Obviously, the dust buildup in the corners and nooks and crannies of your brewery can harbor insects as well. We always suggest you do a light leak check on your silo once a year. So you do that at night with a really bright light stuck through the top of your manhole into the silo, and you do a good inspection, make sure there aren't any pinholes or anything like that. So good quality equipment, properly sized and maintained, will provide a reliable system of malt conveyance for many years. So regulatory bodies and dust control, again, it's important to understand your health and safety. I mean, we deal with this in the malt house. There are certain diseases that malt dust causes, lung diseases. So, you know, you've got to take that in consideration and make sure if you're around dust, you're wearing the proper PPE, as well as keeping dust under control for, you know, explosive reasons as well. You know, dust extraction and collection, we have all of these in our distribution warehouses and at the malt houses, all sorts of filtration. You don't have to probably go that crazy with the volume that we deal with, but certainly some systems might be a good option and a good choice. Again, you've got to check with your local codes. You know, because it's a milled dust product, there may be other explosion relief panel requirements, stuff like that, that you may have to install. So good engineering and housekeeping obviously prevents buildup. That's really the key. You want to pay attention, as I mentioned, those nooks and crannies. You want to pay attention to those hidden accumulation areas. Fault ceilings, ductwork are big sources. You need to use a class 2 rated vacuum for dust removal. They're not that expensive. They're a few $100. You want to keep one of those in the brewery to suck up the extra dust when you can, when you're doing your cleanup. You want to avoid blowing down dusty areas. Gently sweep and vacuum, obviously for obvious reasons. You don't want to blow it up all over the place. And, you know, ideally you want to locate the dust collectors and bucket elevators outside of the building to keep the dust out. Again, talking more about, you know, standard for prevention of fires and dust explosions. There's certain trainings that you can set your employees through. That's obviously recommended, as well as any OSHA information about combustible dust explosions. And you can download all of that from OSHA.gov. So other considerations are, again, is pest control. While maltsters work diligently to provide malt free of pests, it's just literally impossible to stop it from happening at some point. There remains a possibility for pickup of pests during transport or at the brewery site. Also, eggs can actually make it through the malting process. So sometimes eggs are from the field, from where the malt was harvested, and they make it all the way to the brewery in a bag. And with your gently kilned malts, it doesn't necessarily kill the eggs. So insects can literally come from the field where the malt was originally harvested from. Dark roasted malts are typically not of interest to pests, so there's a little less worry there. If you have a small space for storage, that's where you would consider that. The higher risk areas for pest involvement might be where you want to put the dark roasted malts versus your base malts. And solid adjuncts have much more potential for pests. That's why we have a return policy on like flaked products and some raw products like flaked oats, that type of thing, of only 30 days for this reason, because they definitely attract bugs more than regular malt. So good housekeeping and regular maintenance are really key to preventing the ingress of pests. So obviously you want to ensure that silos are capped. You want to make sure they're sealed, right? You don't want water getting in there or pests. You want pest monitoring in all your areas. It's really easy to hire a company to do this for you. That's typically what we do in all of our distribution centers and malt houses. We have a really stringent protocol for pest control in our facilities. Pallets of grain should be stored 6 inches away from any walls if possible. You want to be able to visibly inspect the back, make sure there's nothing camping out back there. Keeping exterior doors closed. I know it's tempting on a nice day, especially later in the day and in the evenings. You want to keep those closed and latched. You want to try to keep any areas where pests can enter the brewery as sealed up as possible. All these things to consider, trying to keep whether it be rodents or bugs or birds out of your brewery. And that's it for me. I know it was a ton of information, probably in a relatively short period of time. So feel free to take a screenshot or take a picture of your phone of my contact info if you don't already have it. And I'll do my best to answer any questions either now or in the future. And thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Jeff. Does anyone have any questions for him? If you do, you can unmute yourself at any time. Go ahead. Did somebody? Okay. Jeff, I had a couple questions. It was a little choppy for me in the beginning, so if you talked about this, I apologize. But I'm curious, should you clean your silo? And if so, what is the best way to do that?
That's a great question. With the straight walled silos, honestly, I don't know many people that do. The best ones come with like a coating applied to the inside, so they stay relatively clean and somewhat maintenance free. I think what happens is if you do want to inspect the silo somewhat regularly, at least a few times a year, by going up to that manway on the top and just taking a look and seeing what's going on inside the silo, making sure there's no leaks. And if you see an issue or you see any buildup on the walls, then certainly it might be time to clean it. Another reason to maybe have like a slide port at the bottom of your silo, and maybe be able to disconnect your grain delivery system from the bottom of your silo easily. And then you literally can just spray it out with a high powered hose or a pressure washer from the top. And that should suffice. It's a little more difficult with a corrugated bin, which actually would need to be cleaned more often. But because of all the nooks and crannies and gaskets involved, if you were to wash that out, it would be pretty difficult to get that dry. And then, then you're going to have issues with, possible mold when you put barley back into it. So again, just another reason why we don't recommend corrugated bins.
Thank you. It kind of a second question for you about it.
Sure.
Is it possible to get moisture built up in your silo from transfers, or is it generally due to maybe any injuries that the silo might have taken on?
As long as your malt supplier is supplying you with malt that's at the appropriate moisture level, you shouldn't have an issue unless water's getting into your silo somehow. And I've had that happen to a couple customers. I've had that happen with brand new silos to a couple customers. So, yeah, I mean, as long as your moisture levels are, below 14% on your malt, you shouldn't have an issue. Even in a humid climate, you should be fine.
Awesome, thank you. And then that leads me to my last question for you. I worked at a brewery once that bought some bagged malt, and I think it was from a new maltster, and the malt had like little tiny bugs in it, and we are trying to figure out what it was, and they said that it was common due to moisture, like they put the malt, they didn't let it dry. I can't remember the name. I think they called it like a pea bowl or something. I don't know if that's a term that you're familiar with, but I'm just curious if you know anything like about that, if that's true or not.
Uh, Weevils and
Beetles.
sawtooth grain beetles are what we see most common.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like you needed another maltster there.
Yeah, definitely. I've never seen anything quite like that, and I'm almost positive they said it was Peebles, which made me laugh because I thought of the store,
Yeah,
and I was like, wait, what? Like, and but it was just interesting. I've never heard of that, and I didn't know if that was if it was a mistake really from the maltster or mistakes of something that we did with storing it.
yeah, it could have been either, right? I mean, that the issue happens to us too. I mean, we mitigate it as best we can. We take a lot of lengths to not let it happen, but it's just a natural occurrence, and sometimes you can't avoid it. Obviously, we have the most trouble in the southeast because it's warm and moist down there, pretty much year round. The cases are isolated, but we always, as soon as it happens to any of our customers, we want pictures of the bugs. We want you to get your malt away from your brewery, throw it out, get it out, but give us as much evidence as you can as far as pictures, so we can identify the type of bugs, obviously lot numbers, so we know where the malt came from, and we immediately replace that product. We always try to back step and find out how it might have happened. And lots of times it is because of the transfer stations in delivery. It has nothing to do with us or our malt house or the field. It just gets infested somehow while it's being transferred to the brewery. And a lot of times it happens at the brewery. And if it's not being properly stored or kept, or it's stored for too long, you can get an infestation just from the bugs in your area. So yeah, we definitely, there's numerous ways it can happen. If it ever happens with any of our products, seemingly most of you are in New York, I would be your contact, and, take good pictures, get them to me ASAP, and we'll get you replacement, as soon as humanly possible.
So you touched briefly on the fact that it's kind of a humidity possibly issue. If that's the case, is it better to store your grain in a different, like separated, even by a wall building, than where you have your brew house?
Oh, for sure. I mean, ideally, you want to have a separate room or separate space. You want to keep the malt away from the brew house for a couple of reasons, right? You want it for the exact reasons you're saying, Jen, moisture with the malt, but also you don't want that dust near your fermenters or your brew house. So yeah, keeping the malt separated as best you can. I mean, obviously it's not possible all the time, but with layouts and blueprints and whatnot, but if you can plan to keep your malt even in a separate room is ideal. You know, a lot of times I see places have a completely separate room with their mill and their malt stored, which isolates the dust to that area, keeps it out of the rest of the brew house. But moisture definitely can cause problems. It definitely promotes bugs if they're there. So for sure, keeping it away from the moist areas in the brew house is definitely a great idea.
Do the grain sacks, like the bags, prevent any moisture from getting to the malt if they're like sealed up?
Yep, our bags are, and I think most suppliers' bags are typically lined with either plastic or some sort of relatively waterproof material. So yeah, as long as you're not dumping water right on the bags, right on the seam of the bags, especially, the bag should protect them from just kind of ambient moisture.
Awesome. And can you get that same issue with like oats, or I'm trying to think of other types of grains that would come through that would be more in like a paper bag versus, like different types of malts?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, the flake products are susceptible to problems, bug problems, moisture problems. They act like sponges. They literally suck up moisture, and that's why it's difficult to, when somebody calls us and wants a replacement on, some flaked oats they've had for 13 months, it's like, it's a little tough because it's probably something happened to it while it was being stored. But yeah, those products are definitely more susceptible to moisture and bugs. So you want to take that in consideration with your storage times, your ordering habits. You want to keep those products as fresh as possible versus regular malt, which, unmilled malt will last for quite a long time. A solid year if it's stored properly.
Well, that led to my last question, which you kind of just answered, is there an expiration date on grain?
There certainly is. It's not like a hardened date like a lot of food products. It's just something that starts declining in quality slowly. So it's hard to put like a hardened expiration date on it. I mean, I would hope to think most breweries are using their grain within a month or two after they receive it, generally speaking, but it's certainly, like I mentioned before, unmilled malt lasts for quite a long time. You can go, up to a year. We even say the milled malt can, if we've milled the malt for a small brewery, as long as, again, it's stored properly, 1 to 2 months, it should be still fine to use. One thing I did forget to mention, which kind of stems off your question, Jen, is silo malt. How long does silo malt last? Well, the same. If it's stored properly, it'll last for quite a long time. But if you're filling your silo once or maybe even twice a year, you might not need a silo. And that might be, the point at where you should have done a tote station to start as you're building your business. My personal opinion is that, before you're considering getting a silo, you should be filling it probably 4 times a year, 3 or 4 times minimum, before you're ready for a silo. And I think that's typically, a few thousand barrels.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. Does anyone have any questions for him before we end the session? Now's your chance.
I miss seeing you all, by the way.
I know, me too.
How you doing, Ethan?
Oh, Kevin, thumbs up. Is that an agreement?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing all right. But yes, I miss everybody too.
Ethan, are you at the brewery?
I am. We have a virtual event at 7:30. It's like a virtual tour and tasting thing. So
Nice.
I had to get down here for that.
I miss you guys. I miss Buffalo. Tell Ryan I said hi.
I will, dude. He's haunting the place somewhere, I think.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining the session. Thank you, Jeff, so much for taking the time out of your day and going over this for us. It was great. Thank you for answering all my questions. I appreciate it. If anybody does have any questions for Jeff, please get in contact with him. He's a great resource for New York State Brewery. I hope we will see everyone tomorrow, 10 a.m. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you to our sponsors as well.
Thanks.
Bye.